Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you for listening, as always. This is episode 10 of our series on the Korean War, entitled Dead Souls. Well, here we are with the penultimate episode of our Korean War series. At the time I'm recording, it is the week of May 20th, 2024, and I intend to sit down and do as much of the editing for this episode as I can over this weekend, meaning the episode should go live around the 27th with any luck. The script for the final episode of the series is nearing completion, and I'm aiming to have that released towards the beginning of next month at some point. Additionally, the Congo Free State episodes will continue to be released bi-weekly as per usual, with the next scheduled to come out on the 25th. As for the edited versions of episodes 1 through 3 of this series, I don't have a concrete idea about when those might come out, but please stay tuned for updates. Before we move on, I'd like to thank you all once again for your patience while I've worked to get the final episodes released. I'll admit I encountered a bit of a writer's block when finishing the script for this part, but now we are very much back on track, and I promise I will do my best to avoid this problem from recurring in the future. So, with that out of the way, let's begin. Since in this episode I plan to break somewhat with the chronological order that we've followed thus far, I will not spend too much time recapping what we covered in the last episode, but in brief, the war in Korea reached a stalemate in the spring of 1951. In July, a little over 1 year since the hostilities initially began, representatives of the two warring factions met to discuss the terms of an armistice. These negotiations were acrimonious and progress was slow going. It took some 4 months for the two sides to reach an agreement regarding the first of the three main items on the agenda, the parameters of a truce line that would serve as the basis for a demilitarized zone once hostilities ended. The second agenda item, the prisoners of war, would prove to be far more of a contentious issue, so much so that it would take another year and a half, thousands more deaths, and untold further destruction and immiseration for the two sides to finally reach an agreement on this question. The subject of the POWs remains highly controversial even to this day, leading author T.R. Fehrenbach to declare, quote, "The POW camps have been much more widely publicized than the battlefields," end quote. While I think this is somewhat of an exaggeration, it is true that the POWs have become an indelible part of the way that the Korean War is remembered, especially in the West. Volumes on volumes of research have been written on this subject, as have countless memoirs, not to mention novels and films and the like. Now, because so much attention has been paid to the POW issue, both then and now, and so much importance has been ascribed to it, I feel that this series on the Korean War would be incomplete if I didn't delve into the topic in some depth. As I did the research, I really began to understand just how complex of a topic this was, and eventually it dawned on me that it might be necessary to devote an entire episode to it if I wanted to do the subject any justice. So, in this episode, I'd like to examine the POW issue from every angle possible, looking not only at the experiences of the Westerners, Americans, British, and so on, but also those of the Chinese and, of course, the Koreans themselves. The practice of capturing and imprisoning enemy combatants has been an aspect of war since the first organized conflicts in human history. In the modern period, the nations of the world have made efforts to define the rights of prisoners of war and to enshrine these rights in international law. At the time that the Korean War began, the most recent of these efforts was the 1949 Geneva Convention, which both belligerent factions agreed to respect the terms of at the onset of armistice negotiations. This, of course, raises a question as to how the POW issue became such a formidable obstacle to peace in the first place. If you'll recall from the previous episode, the issue ultimately came down to the question of voluntary versus obligatory repatriation. In other words, whether the prisoners themselves would be allowed to choose not to be returned to their home countries after the war. The notion of voluntary repatriation did not have precedent in international law, but decision-makers in the United States had come to see adopting such a plan as desirable given their moral and strategic considerations. The Communists, on the other hand, refused to consider it, as its implementation had the potential to deal a significant blow to their political legitimacy. Taking all of this into account, I think a reasonable conclusion to make vis-a-vis the Geneva Convention is that the 1949 treaty, adopted as it was in response to the specific circumstances of the Second World War, was not at all suited to address the realities of warfare in the post-World War II era. now that ideological concerns were the main driving force behind international conflict, at least to a greater degree than they had been in the past. Decision makers on both sides of the Korean War were ultimately approaching the issue within the framework of the Cold War, and always with their own best interests in mind as far as their respective ideologies were concerned. But that's enough about the diplomatic side of things. We'll have a lot more to say about that in the next episode. For now, I'd like to discuss the prisoners of war themselves, beginning with Western prisoners in communist custody. In Sheila Miyoshi Jager's excellent study of the Korean conflict, Brothers at War, the 10th chapter is dedicated entirely to a discussion of POWs, with the first half of the chapter following a specific group of Western prisoners as they were held in the various internment camps of North Korea and transferred between them throughout the course of the war. I think that a narrative-driven approach like this can be a useful way to look at the experiences of the POWs and analyze how their conditions changed over time in response to developments during the war. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first POWs of the Korean War were a group of Western civilians who were captured in or around Seoul by the Korean People's Army in the first weeks of the conflict. Most of them were Christian missionaries, hailing from the United States, France, and Australia. Among them was one Herbert A. Lord, the director of the Salvation Army's activity in Korea. Shortly after being captured, this group of detainees was held in a building that was evidently an old schoolhouse that had been hastily repurposed into a prison facility. Ironically, most of the buildings the North Koreans used to hold POWs during the war were remnants of Japanese rule. By September, this initial group of prisoners had been joined by over 700 American soldiers who had been captured during the battles of Osan and the Busan perimeter. The following month, this entire group was suddenly moved to Manpo, a city on the southern bank of the Yalu River, close to the Chinese border. The prisoners had very limited knowledge of outside events, but they were vaguely aware that something significant had occurred. In time, their suspicions were confirmed by reports of the landings at Incheon and the subsequent advance of UN forces across the 38th parallel. The prisoners had come to believe that a total UN victory and their liberation were close at hand. As one POW, U.S. Army Lieutenant Wade Roundtree put it, quote, "We took it for granted that our captors would hold us in Manpo until the United Nations forces could reach us," end quote. After China entered the conflict in October, however, the possibility of rescue became far more remote. Roundtree recalled the sense of defeat he felt as he watched Chinese soldiers march by their camp. Quote, "It was one of the saddest moments of my life. None of us needed to be told how much this turn of events could affect our lives. For a week, we watched the seemingly endless stream of Chinese soldiers pouring into Korea. It was a depressing sight. This was, without question, one of the most miserable periods of my captivity," end quote. Indeed, their situation was about to get a lot more miserable. A week or so later, the prisoners were told that they would be transferred to a different prison camp over 250 kilometers to the west. To their shock, they were also told that they would have to make the entire journey on foot. In the initial months of the war, the North Koreans transported prisoners across the country by train, but as the steadily escalating UN bombing campaign laid waste to the country's transportation infrastructure, this was no longer possible. The day before they were set to depart, the assembled prisoners were addressed by the commandant of the prison camp, a North Korean army colonel known to them only as the Tiger. His existence is attested to by many survivors, but his true identity remains unknown to this day as far as I can tell. The Tiger told them that the journey ahead was going to be long and arduous, but they were nonetheless expected to march the entire way in strict military formation. When one prisoner expressed concern that some in the group were not trained soldiers and that they may not be capable of completing the journey under such conditions, the Tiger is said to have responded, quote, "Then let them march until they die. This is a military order," end quote. As listeners of this series should be aware by now, winters in Korea are notoriously treacherous, especially in the north. The prisoners were ill-equipped to survive in these conditions. Most were still wearing the exact same tattered clothes that they had been captured in that summer. Surely enough, by the second day of the march, the first few prisoners collapsed from exhaustion and were left to die on the side of the road. As one American soldier recalled, quote, "The merciless pressure was especially weakening for the many who were suffering from severe dysentery, which appeared to be rife among the GIs," end quote. As time went on, more and more prisoners fell. One survivor estimated that the group was losing approximately 1 man per mile traveled. When the Tiger noticed the precipitous drop in morale as a result of these deaths, he decided to summarily execute 5 of the officers that he had designated to lead the other prisoners. Thanks to the intercession of one of the missionaries, he relented and agreed to execute only one of them, the unfortunate man being one Lieutenant Thornton from Texas. An impromptu court-martial was held, where Thornton was found guilty and sentenced to death. The following eyewitness account is contained in Jager's book. Quote, "There, you have your trial," the Tiger announced. "In Texas, sir, we would call this a lynching," Lieutenant Thornton responded. The Tiger then asked Thornton if he wanted to be blindfolded. Hearing an affirmative answer, he handed a small towel to a guard. Another towel was used to tie the victim's hands together. The Tiger moved smartly to face the victim and ordered him to turn around. Pausing for a moment, the Tiger pushed up the back of Thornton's fur cap. But, like Father Crombie, I had already seen too much. My eyes snapped shut just before the Tiger fired his pistol into the back of Thornton's head. When I opened my eyes, I saw that brave young man lying still without even a tremor. The Tiger clearly knew his business well. Quickly putting away his pistol, he called for another prisoner to come to his side and translate. "You have just witnessed the execution of a bad man. This will help us work together in peace and harmony." In this brief speech, the Tiger managed to outrage both the living and the dead. End quote. Scenes such as this continued to play out along the route as prisoners who were unable to keep up with the rest of the group were shot. After a grueling 9-day trek, the prisoners arrived at their destination, a prison camp at the village of Changni. The camp, which had been designated by the northern authorities as Camp 7, was, much like the last one had been, a schoolhouse that had fallen into disuse since the end of Japanese rule. Survivors of this Camp 7 reported that conditions there were more or less typical of communist POW camps during this time. A starvation diet, forced labor, horrific sanitary conditions, and so on. These and other factors had the effect of, quote, mercilessly grinding down men. The dehumanization process that went on attempted to turn human beings into sheep, end quote. Under such conditions, prisoners here died at an appalling rate. In fact, of the 750 men who were marched to Camp 7 in November 1950, only 1/3 were still alive by the following spring. Approximately 90% of all deaths of prisoners in communist custody occurred during the winter of 1950 to 1951. Now, this particular camp, Camp 7, was unique in that even after China's intervention, when the Chinese assumed responsibility for administering most of the POW camps, this camp continued to be run solely by the North Koreans for the duration of the war. The Chinese made a concerted effort to treat their prisoners at least marginally better than their North Korean counterparts did, for reasons that we will discuss shortly. The North Koreans, on the other hand, appear to have felt more or less indifferent to the fates of their prisoners, or at least the Western ones. According to one survivor of the Tiger's Death March, he once explained to them, quote, "You have made this march to atone for the sin of coming to Korea," end quote. Now, by all accounts, the Tiger was an unusually cruel individual, and his statements may not have reflected the attitudes of the North Koreans as a whole. In fact, when a senior staff officer of the KPA was informed of the Tiger's crimes, he had him relieved of duty, after which point he disappears from the historical record entirely. Survivors attested that the worst of the abuses, the beatings, summary executions, and whatnot, stopped after the Tiger's reign ended. How then does one explain the continued excessive deaths of POWs in North Korean custody? Author Max Hastings, who usually makes no attempt to disguise his contempt for communism and communists, suggests that a great majority of these deaths can ultimately be attributed to the North Koreans' chronic supply shortages, which were especially pronounced during the winter of 1950 to 1951. He points out that at the time, the North Koreans hardly had enough supplies for their own men, let alone their prisoners. Their ability to provide medical treatment to the prisoners was severely limited, hence the large proportion of deaths from untreated wounds or preventable diseases like dysentery and beriberi. Curiously, though, Hastings describes another phenomenon that led to deaths of men in captivity, something he refers to as give-up-itis. Men would simply lose all willpower, giving up the will to live, much less eat. They would simply lay down and waste away until they died. One POW, a U.S. Army lieutenant named Walt Mayo, offered his explanation, quote, "It was simply easier to die than it was to live. At the time, we tried to do as much amateur psychology as we could, but the problem was sheer despair," end quote. With the intervention of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army in October 1950 and the subsequent retreat of UN forces back across the 38th parallel, hundreds more Westerners fell into communist captivity. One such individual was Major Harry Fleming, an American military advisor attached to the 6th Division of the ROK Army. This was one of only 2 Allied units that was able to physically reach the Yalu River during the incursion into North Korea. The 6th Division encountered the PVA at the Battle of Onjong. Caught by surprise and deep within enemy territory, the South Korean soldiers panicked and fled. Fleming and a small party tried to fight their way back to friendly territory, but after 3 days they were caught by a PVA patrol and captured. They were taken to a place their captors referred to as Valley Camp. This was a prison camp that had been set up in barracks that were originally built by the Japanese to house Korean mine laborers. As captured UN servicemen continued to be marched to the camp in the days and weeks that followed, it became apparent that the existing facilities were not at all sufficient for the sheer number of prisoners that were being held there, some 750 of them by that point. According to one of the survivors, quote, each of the mud-walled houses, with 3 small rooms and a kitchen, were made to house roughly 60 prisoners. This meant that the width that each individual had on the floor was so narrow that everyone on one side of the room had to lie on the same side at the same time. You could not lie on your back, and when you moved, everyone else had to move in unison, end quote. Upon his arrival, Major Fleming decided to take charge of the situation and led an effort to improve the camp's conditions. His first step was to meet with the camp's commandants, of which there were 2, one Chinese and the other North Korean. Fleming found the North Korean commandant uncooperative, but he made a better impression on his Chinese counterpart, who, evidently, was the senior partner in the relationship. The Chinese commandant permitted Fleming to tour the camp to determine what changes needed to be made to improve living conditions. The major had his work cut out for him at the very least. The issues affecting the prisoners were readily apparent, as he reports. Quote, these men were suffering from hunger just as much as we were at the time. They were having hallucinations about food, and I got many requests, believe it or not, for chocolate or candy or other such things. Everything was filthy and the men were covered in lice. All suffered from dysentery and many from pneumonia, end quote. But just as concerning to Major Fleming, perhaps even more so, was the complete lack of discipline among the enlisted men. Essentially, from the first moment a new prisoner or group of prisoners was taken into custody, the Chinese made an effort to break the already existing chain of command. They were told something along the lines of, quote, everybody here is the same. There are no officers or NCOs here. No one here has any rank. You are all equal, end quote. The underlying idea here, to separate officers from the enlisted men to make organized resistance more difficult, was not a new innovation. What made the Chinese communist strategy unique was that they didn't try to accomplish this by physically separating the 2 groups, at least not at first. By encouraging the enlisted men to think of themselves as being equal to their officers, they were subverting the disciplinary structure of the military instead of simply putting barriers that made enacting discipline impossible. This would have the additional effect, not unintentional, of priming the prisoners for indoctrination, but we will discuss that more in a bit. The enlisted men themselves had varying attitudes on the situation. Some embraced their new equal status, or, maybe more accurately, they found it gratifying to see their officers taken down a peg, as Fehrenbach writes, quote, this had an immediate appeal for many men. One soldier went up to his officer and slapped him on the back, asking, hey Jack, how the hell are you? He thought it was very funny. End quote. Still, there were others who welcomed the persistent attempts of some officers to continue to provide leadership for their men while in captivity. This was the case with Major Fleming and the enlisted men of Camp 7. The first, most important change Fleming introduced to the camp was the creation of regular sanitation routines. Latrines were dug, water had to be boiled before use, and so on. Thanks to these and similar measures, the death rate at Camp 7 dropped significantly, down to just 3%. As one serviceman testified, quote, the morale at this camp was pretty good, and I think that is why the death rate was so low, end quote. Still, conditions stood to be improved more somewhat, especially regarding rations. The North Korean commandant offered to substantially improve rations if prisoners wrote and signed leaflets to be dropped on or near UN positions, urging their fellow soldiers to surrender. Most refused the offer, as Fleming reports, quote, they repeated their warning that all those who refused to cooperate would perish. The younger, stronger officers believed that U.S. forces would arrive to rescue us in just a few weeks, and that we should all tell Commandant Kim to go to hell, end quote. But as time went on with no sign of rescue, it was becoming increasingly apparent to the prisoners that the UN forces were highly unlikely to make another successful push to the Yalu River. Just as impossible was the prospect of escape. Since the POW camps tended to be located far to the north along the border with China, The nearest friendly territory was at minimum 200 miles away, through a hostile countryside. This didn't dissuade a handful of people from making the attempt. None of them made it very far without being captured or killed. As the dreary reality of their situation started to set in, it was becoming just as apparent to them that the price of better treatment, and perhaps of survival, was some form of collaboration with their communist captors, and, as it would turn out, many were willing to pay this price. In mid-January 1951, some of the more uncooperative prisoners were marched 6 miles to the northwest to another camp near the town of Pyeongtaung. There was already a sizable number of prisoners held here, mainly survivors of the UN's disastrous rout at the Battle of Kunu-ri in late November. Among them was a 22-year-old African-American infantryman named Clarence Adams, whose story we will discuss in greater detail later in this episode. At the time that Adams first arrived, this camp, Camp 5, was also administered solely by the North Koreans. One newcomer to the camp remarked that the men there had, quote, been reduced to an almost animalistic state. They would sit and watch with a wolfish look, and if a man was unable to eat, they would grab it away from him, end quote. Another prisoner describes this phenomenon in greater detail, quote, you don't think as clearly as you would under normal conditions. A man's instinct goes back to self-preservation, and I know my own personal thoughts were mostly devoted to food. I didn't think at all about my home or my wife because I was primarily interested in food, end quote. The Americans had a very difficult time adjusting to a diet primarily consisting of raw grain, usually sorghum or millet. The death rate among prisoners at Camp 5 was worse than it had been at Camp 7, as Hanley describes, quote, in the frigid midwinter Yalu River Valley, the Americans began dying almost immediately upon their arrival at the Pyeongtaung prison camp. Even the men on burial detail are dropping dead at the edge of a mass grave, to join those who came before. Those who didn't die or weren't shot on that horrible 100-mile trek that December found only cold and crowded huts at Pyeongtaung, a starvation diet, and a lone Korean doctor whose prescription for ill prisoners was fresh air, effectively a sentence to die by hypothermia. The first to die among the captive American soldiers were the wounded, whose wounds were left untreated, became infected, and killed them. Now men die from starvation, in some cases because they simply cannot stomach the paltry daily ration of a quarter cup of raw corn, beans, or sorghum. Some refuse to eat and let themselves fade away. They're also dying from disease, from frostbite-related gangrene infections, from deficient diet killers such as beriberi and pellagra, and especially from untreated dysentery and cholera. End quote. By May of 1951, the Chinese took over administration of the camp from the North Koreans. From that point onward, conditions began to improve, but only gradually. The reason why the Chinese generally treated their prisoners better than the North Koreans was in large part because the Chinese believed that it would be possible to convert at least some UN prisoners to their ideology and entice them to defect. If this was carried out successfully, the propaganda value would be immense. Psychological experiments designed to achieve these results were carried out by the Chinese on UN POWs during the Korean War, and were reported in the Western press as brainwashing. The term itself is derived from the Mandarin Chinese term "shi nao," literally translated as wash brain. Its first recorded use in English is dated to 1950. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions around the term brainwashing, so to be clear, brainwashing, at least in this context, is not the same thing as mind control as it is often depicted in popular culture. Rather, I think that terms like re-education and even indoctrination are more accurate. The Chinese did not attempt to control prisoners' thoughts and actions through the use of drugs or hypnosis. Rather, they used a combination of psychological and social conditioning to induce them to alter their beliefs willingly and to join the communist cause. Initially, the primary laboratory where these experiments were carried out was Camp 10, near the city of Kangye in northern central Korea. The conditions at Camp 10 were much unlike the other POW camps in North Korea as previously described. At this camp, the Chinese provided their prisoners with ample food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention for them to live in a reasonable degree of comfort. From the beginning of their internment in this camp, the Chinese tried to encourage compliance. They did not refer to their prisoners as such, but rather as students. They told them that they had been fooled by their leaders into coming to Korea, a country that they had no business being in. They were also told something along the lines of, quote, "The quicker you learn what we have to teach you, the sooner you will be released and sent back," end quote. Early on, the prisoners, or students rather, were divided into cadres of about 10, each being led by a specially designated prisoner who was tasked with overseeing the re-education process. The re-education regimen consisted of independent study, interspersed with group discussions and regular lectures by camp staff. The content of the political lectures was about what one might expect. The virtues of communism were extolled, as were those of the vibrant new revolutionary society being built by the people of China, while the assorted evils of American capitalism and imperialism were denounced. The lectures repeatedly tried to drive home the point that, quote, America's intervention in Korea is the work of Wall Street profiteers. It is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, end quote. All this was done in a way that came off as being heavy-handed to American sensibilities. The lecturers discovered that the average American GI had little beyond an elementary education, and as a result, a lot of the ideas that were being discussed simply went over their heads. The terms that the former POWs themselves used to describe these lectures include tedious, boring, and monotonous. They were indeed quite time-consuming. On average, prisoners spent between 4 to 6 hours a day in these classes. One of the main reasons for this was the language barrier, since everything that was said had to be laboriously translated from Chinese to English. Attendance at these daily lectures was mandatory, and while actual instances of physical violence as punishment were somewhat rare, they were constantly implied. News from the outside world was rare within the camps and was hardly trustworthy. The only news publication allowed was the Daily Worker, an English-language communist newspaper published out of Chicago. Short news briefings written by the North Koreans also circulated, which tended to exaggerate the scale of UN defeats. After some time, the prisoners were allowed to start their own publications. One was a newsletter called New Life, and it featured prisoner-authored articles with titles such as Truman is a Swindler, The Truth About the Marshall Plan, We Were Paid Killers, and Capitalism and Its Aims. One article of note contained a speech made by one POW at a Christmas party the Chinese organized for some of their prisoners at Camp 10. Published under the succinct title of If the Millionaires Want War, Let Them Pick Up the Guns and Do the Fighting Themselves, the speech read in part, quote, The Germans were Christians, but they did not allow us to spend our Christmas happily. The Chinese do not observe Christmas, but they have arranged this fine party for us. The Nazis beat their prisoners, they spat on us, and forced us to stand for intolerably long hours at a time. Some of us who could not stand this torture were forced to urinate in their trousers. But the Chinese have given us warm clothes, bedding, and even hand towels. They have shared their food with us, and they have given us the best that they had. This has taught me a lot of things, I can tell you. When I get home this time, they would not be able to get me in the army again. If the millionaires want war, let them pick up the guns and do the fighting themselves. End quote. Articles like this, which repeated anti-capitalist rhetoric, appeared frequently in New Life and were interpreted by camp authorities as evidence that their re-education program was working as intended. However, there were limits to the program's success. Despite the persistent efforts to indoctrinate these prisoners, the lessons they tried to impart simply did not take root the way that it was hoped they would. Ultimately, the program produced very few sincere converts to the communist cause. Most prisoners who expressed viewpoints such as those seen in camp newsletters or who otherwise collaborated with the Chinese mostly did so for reasons of self-preservation. As one former prisoner recalled, quote, I think the best way to explain this passive attitude is in the words of Major McLaughlin. He told us that in order to save lives, he saw nothing wrong with getting along with the program to a certain extent, end quote. As of March 1951, however, these facts were not quite as evident to the authorities of Camp 10 when they closed the camp after just 4 months, with plans to expand the indoctrination program and to introduce elements of it to the other camps. Living conditions within the POW camps improved drastically when the armistice negotiations began in July 1951. As one survivor recalled, quote, the only time we started getting food was after we were turned over to the Chinese, and that was after the peace talks had started up. Until that time, we had practically been living on nothing, end quote. Author Charles Hanley offers the following description, quote, although life slowly improves for the prisoners, it remains a wretched existence. Dysentery, fevers, night blindness, and other ills from infections and deficient diets continue to afflict many. Winter's plagues of lice are followed by summer's arrival of bed bugs, rats, fleas, and flies. Air raid alerts in the Yalu River Valley fray their nerves, but compared with the malign neglect of the North Korean overseers last winter, when hundreds of American POWs died of starvation, disease, and untreated wounds, summer survivors now have reason to hope that they'll outlast this war." End quote. In fact, these men were correct to think this way. The worst part of their ordeal was over. Again, most of the POWs who died in communist custody, 90% by most estimates, died during the winter of 1950 to 1951. But though they no longer had to worry about wasting away from starvation or from cholera, a more familiar, mundane affliction began to take hold: boredom. To be sure, the prisoners' re-education occupied a lot of their time, and now that they were not liable to collapse and die while performing manual labor, they were occasionally assigned various maintenance duties like chopping wood or trapping flies. Still, there was a lot of idle time, and the prisoners did find some inventive methods to pass the days within the confines of the camps. Reading, which camp authorities referred to as independent study, was actively encouraged. Reading material was mainly nonfiction, works by communist theorists like Marx, Lenin, and of course Mao. The only works of fiction permitted had to be deemed ideologically sound by the censors. A few examples are Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Novels by authors like Charles Dickens and John Steinbeck were also quite common, as they were thought to paint a sufficiently bleak picture of the plight of the working class in the Western world. These camp libraries tended not to have the most extensive selection of titles, and out of boredom, some prisoners would begin to obsessively read the few books they had cover to cover, only to start over again the minute they were done. One source of entertainment were the dogfights between the MiG-15 and F-86 Sabre fighter jets that I described at length in the previous episode. The action usually took place too high in the sky for anyone on the ground to distinguish the combatants by sight, and instead they had to go off the sounds of their weapons. In warmer weather, prisoners would forage for edible plants in the grass within their enclosures. Wild onions and turnips were used to supplement their usual rations of raw grain. Sometimes the prisoners would discover marijuana, which grows in the wild in Korea and apparently has for quite some time. Apparently, weed smoking became a common pastime in the camps, providing a welcome distraction from the drudgery of day-to-day life. Occasionally, the more bold prisoners would play practical jokes on their captors. In Peters and Lee's book, Voices from the Korean War, Lieutenant Wade Roundtree recounts an amusing anecdote from his time in the camps. Quote, "I must tell the story about Lieutenant John Thornton and his motorcycle. Every morning and every afternoon he would appear for roll call riding an imaginary motorcycle. With unmistakable sound effects, John would circle around the group several times, park his motorcycle, and join the formation. Not surprisingly, the Chinese thought that he was a little affected. They called John to their headquarters and informed him that he could no longer keep his motorcycle as it was against camp regulations. When John returned and told the story to the others, some of the men actually approached the Chinese and demanded that they return his motorcycle." End quote. Other POWs tell about stealing the camp's dinner bell and hiding it in the latrine, or coming up with provocative questions to ask during the mandatory lectures. Pranks like these had the double effect of amusing the prisoners and defying the authority of their captors in ways that wouldn't get them collectively punished. As time went on and the communist logistics situation improved, the Chinese gradually introduced more amenities to the camps. Sports equipment and facilities, kitchens to allow the prisoners to cook their own food, playing cards and chess sets, and of course, more books. The Chinese even organized a mock Olympic Games for the POWs to compete in. Held in late November 1952 in Pyeongtaek County, North Korea, the Games saw over 500 athletes from various different camps and representing 11 different countries participate in a variety of different sporting events. Some were traditional Olympic sports, like track and field, gymnastics, soccer, and wrestling. Others were not so traditional, like basketball, American football, and baseball, as well as some even more unusual ones, like tug-of-war and sack race. The games were organized in accordance with the Olympic Charter, with prisoners acting as referees, judges, photographers, and so on. Meticulous records were kept, listing the name, service number, and nationality of each competitor. Of course, the propaganda value of the Olympics should be self-evident, a demonstration that the prisoners in communist custody were healthy and virile enough to compete in such feats of athleticism. The Olympics often featured in pamphlets intended to entice UN soldiers to surrender. Many Western historians view the 1952 Intercamp POW Olympics as being little more than a spectacle staged for these purposes. They speculate that prisoners were forced to participate against their will. Testimony from the participants themselves suggests otherwise. In a 2000 interview, Australian veteran Bob Parker claimed that by the time the games were held, the worst of the prisoners' ordeal had passed. Confident that the end of the war was imminent, the prisoners' morale was at its highest. Participation in the Olympics, therefore, was done, for one, on a voluntary basis, and secondly, in a spirit of friendly competition. He further claims that none of the participants had any sense that their activities would be exploited for any kind of political gain. U.S. Army Sergeant Lloyd W. Pate explained how he and his fellow prisoners saw things at that time. Quote, "You have to understand that this was the first time in 2 years that the prisoners had been allowed to intermingle with each other. It was the first time they had the opportunity to travel to different camps to check on each other. There were guys vying to get on the teams to get a chance to see their old buddies. To find them and actually get to talk to them was a huge morale booster for our men. At the same time, the Chinese got to pass out their propaganda material, so both sides won. Oh, there might have been a few who were collaborators, but the great majority of men who participated in the Olympics were not collaborators." End quote. Meanwhile, efforts to expand the re-education programs to the other camps began and met with mixed results. The basic strategy essentially remained the same. Prisoners were compelled to attend lectures and reading groups on a regular basis, with those who demonstrated receptiveness to communist ideology receiving preferential treatment, while troublesome prisoners were subjected to further deprivation. The camp administrators began to refer to the former group as progressives and the latter as reactionaries. As we've already seen, the communists sought to instrumentalize the progressives for propaganda purposes. At first, these efforts were mainly directed towards the other prisoners, as the publications like those I described earlier never circulated outside the POW camps. But in February 1951, a group of 20 or so prisoners was relocated to a new camp, Camp 12, just outside Pyongyang. Here they were instructed to make radio broadcasts intended for their fellow soldiers who were still out there fighting. Over 200 of these broadcasts were made in the course of that year. The specifics varied somewhat from one addressed to another, but the message being conveyed was quite consistent. Those listening were invited to surrender to the communists, who promised them, to directly quote one broadcast that was made in May 1951, quote, "kind treatment, in strict accordance with the principles of humanity and democracy," end quote. Prisoners in other camps were asked to write leaflets with similar messages to be dropped on UN positions, or to sign petitions addressed to the U.S. government or the United Nations. In an instance of the latter, the Chinese began a campaign in January 1952 to get prisoners to sign on to the Stockholm Appeal. The appeal was an initiative of an international organization called the World Peace Council and was initially introduced in March 1950, 3 months before the outbreak of war in Korea. The initial version of the document concerned the banning of nuclear weapons, but it was subsequently amended to call for an end to the hostilities in Korea. The Stockholm Appeal and the organization that sponsored it were dismissed by U.S. officials as mere products of Soviet intrigue. It's worth reiterating that, save for a few special cases, most of the so-called progressives did not collaborate with their captors out of any genuine convictions, but in the hope of improving their living conditions. Upon being released, several former collaborators expressed regret at what they'd done while in captivity. One such prisoner, U.S. Army Captain Clifford Allen, later testified, quote, "It was through these conditions of life, these predatory conditions of life, I should say, that the communists reduced us all to a very servile state, where they almost got us to the point that we would do anything they wanted us to, because we had nothing to fall back on, and no strength left. When a man is sick, starving, and freezing, he loses his ability to rationalize." End quote. At the same time, efforts were made to marginalize those designated as reactionaries. There are a whole host of psychological factors that may explain why some people were better able to resist communist indoctrination attempts than others, particularly strong religious convictions or loyalty to a country that one had devoted years of their life in service of, for instance. Age and education level undoubtedly played a role too. Generally, the younger and less educated a prisoner was, the more susceptible he was to re-education. Camp administrators concluded that the most intractable reactionaries of all were the officers. From the beginning, the Chinese had tried to sow division between the officers and enlisted men by insisting that the two groups receive equal treatment. But when this failed to completely break the chain of command, it was determined that it was physically necessary to separate them. To that end, in August 1952, about 130 prisoners classified as reactionaries were relocated to a prison camp near Wada. Designated as Camp 4, it was run as a penal camp more in the Stalinist faction than the Maoist one. Since these prisoners had been deemed unreeducatable, they were compelled to do hard labor, often things as meaningless as breaking large rocks into smaller rocks. The conditions were difficult, but group cohesion remained strong, and it couldn't be broken regardless of the tactics employed. As one survivor, British Army officer David Fortune attested, quote, "Everyone in that camp was a good man. Morale was much higher. There were no informers, no collaborators, and no burden of mutual distrust," end quote. After just a few months, the Chinese considered this experiment to have failed and liquidated Camp 4, redistributing its inmates among the other camps. The reactionaries developed an intense hatred of the progressive prisoners, branding them as traitors for collaborating with their captors against their ostensible brothers-in-arms. An atmosphere of distrust became pervasive throughout the camps, so much so to the point where anyone even suspected of collaborating with the Chinese, even if it had been with good intention, faced ostracization. Even those who were completely innocent of such charges got caught up. Major Harry Fleming, the American officer whose efforts to improve living conditions in Camp 7 I described earlier, became a pariah among his fellow officers. One prisoner, Captain Waldron Berry, recalled, quote, "I do not recall ever having spoken to him. His reputation as a collaborator effectively precluded any conversation with him as far as I was concerned," end quote. Another officer, Fleming's friend Paul Lyles, later testified how entire camps would be given the progressive label due to the actions of just a handful of individuals. Quote, "Conditions at Camp 5 and 2 were much better. We at Camp 12 were the worst off, and still we were the ones that were called traitors, which is a nasty name. There were a lot of loudmouths there, a lot of self-professed patriots waving the flag and calling each other nasty names," end quote. Curiously, the Chinese also tried to stoke resentment among the American prisoners along racial lines. In previous episodes, I've made passing references to the state of race relations in the US circa the 1950s, but here I think it's time I discuss the subject in a bit more detail. Earlier, you might remember that I referenced Clarence Adams, an African-American soldier who was captured in the Battle of Cunu Ri. Adams is significant in that he was one of the few Allied servicemen who chose not to be repatriated after the war, and because of this, I think his story merits retelling in some detail. Adams was born in 1929 in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1946, at the age of 17, Adams joined the Army to escape the conditions of segregation and poverty in which he had grown up. For 3 years, Adams served in the U.S. Army on occupation duty in South Korea, and his period of enlistment was nearing its end when war broke out in June 1950. To provide a bit of context, at that time, many laws enforcing racial segregation were still on the books in the United States, and the civil rights movement really had yet to emerge. For context, Brown versus the Board of Education, the landmark case that outlawed segregation in public schools, was not decided until 1954, a year after the war's conclusion. That said, appreciable efforts had been made to desegregate certain institutions in American life, most notably the military. In 1948, President Truman signed an executive order, number 9981, which mandated, quote, "equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin," end quote. Attempts to enforce desegregation in the military were generally met with resistance, making the whole process longer and more arduous than had been expected. At the time the Korean War began, the Air Force was the only branch of the U.S. military to have been fully integrated. In the Army, de facto segregation remained in place, with most African-American soldiers still serving in all-black regiments, including the one that Adams served in, the 503rd Artillery Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division. According to T.R. Fehrenbach, all-black units had a spotty combat record during the war and acquired a poor reputation across the military because of this. He chalked this up to an issue with morale, but Adams and other black servicemen tell a different story. They allege that all black units were seen as expendable, often given undesirable missions or used as cannon fodder to spare other units from heavy losses. In his memoir, Adams describes having felt this way during the fateful battle at Cunu Ri, quote, "Our regiment was hit hard and we slowly tried to pull back. For several days, we got no sleep. We hardly had time to eat because we were frantically trying to stop the Chinese from completely overrunning us. We'd set up our mortars, fire them, load them onto the tractors that carried them, and then move on to the next location where we do the same thing again and again. The Chinese were all around us, constantly firing on our position, and we knew that it was only a matter of time before they closed in. At dawn one morning, I noticed that the 105th Artillery Regiment was in full retreat. I asked, "Where are those white boys going?" but no one answered. Later that day, a company of white infantrymen also retreated past us, and we were ordered to turn our 155mm guns around and lay down cover fire so that they could escape. At this point, I realized that something must have been terribly wrong. According to conventional military strategy, heavy artillery, like the kind that my regiment operated, was always protected by infantry, but now the exact opposite was happening. As a result, when it came time for us to go, we had no one to protect us. We did have some light weapons, but we weren't set up to fight like an infantry unit. There was no doubt in my mind that our black regiment was being sacrificed to save white troops." End quote. A similar, more widely known incident along these lines occurred later in the war, in late October 1952, when 162 soldiers of the 65th Infantry Regiment, an all-Puerto Rican unit, were arrested for desertion after failing to hold a hill against overwhelming enemy forces. 95 were court-martialed, of whom all but 4 were convicted and sentenced to between 1 and 18 years hard labor. One caveat I will make, though, is that the 65th Infantry Regiment was not an officially segregated unit, since the Puerto Ricans defied racial classification by the standards of the time. As for the remaining units that were officially segregated, meaning the all-black regiments, they were disbanded in the autumn of 1951 at General Ridgway's order. Their personnel were redistributed to other units at a rate of about 10%, proportionate to the United States racial demographics at the time. This had been done on practical grounds rather than moral or ethical ones, as shortages of personnel made maintaining segregated units more difficult. The underlying socioeconomic causes of racial inequality remained unaddressed. The average Chinese or North Korean soldier was unlikely to have seen a person of African descent up close before the war. Their knowledge of American race relations were limited. At most, they were vaguely aware that some sort of enmity existed between the white Americans and the black ones. Pre-existing racial tensions in the military did not dissipate within the camps, and there were occasional instances of racial violence breaking out between prisoners, prompting the Chinese camp officials to separate the white and black prisoners for the safety of the latter group. In his memoir, Adams remarks how the Chinese, quote, did not understand how, even under the most adverse of conditions, this racial hatred and inability to cooperate with one another still dominated so many white Americans, end quote. When they eventually came to understand how prevalent this hatred truly was, another question came to vex them. Why were so many blacks fighting in this war for the white man's interests? According to one black soldier, he was questioned along these lines upon being captured. Quote, they asked why I was in Korea, fighting them in their own country, while my people in America were constantly being dehumanized, raped, hanged, and killed by the same white people I was fighting alongside, against them. End quote. Of course, this was something that they were trying to find out themselves. Curtis Morrow, a Korean War veteran who became an artist after the war, addressed this question in his provocatively titled memoir, What's a Commie Ever Done to Black People? Quote, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and every other fighting man in this war must be telling each other that we, black people, Negroes, colored folks, whatever the hell else they wanted to call us, must be the biggest fools in the world. End quote. The Chinese believed that the black soldiers' experiences of discrimination in the United States might make them more receptive to re-education, and they altered their messaging towards black prisoners accordingly. Their usual rhetoric about this being a rich man's war and a poor man's fight and whatnot took on an added racial dimension. One POW named Robert Fletcher summarized the sort of lectures that he and his fellow black prisoners sat through on a fairly regular basis. Quote, you know that white people will never let you control anything in the United States. They're always going to control the money, control the jobs, put their friends in positions of power, while you will only be allowed to go just far. What you need is to go back to your country and start a revolution. End quote. Just like with their white compatriots, their reception was mixed. Many simply shrugged it away, but others, like Adams, seemed to have really internalized this message. As he explains in his memoir, quote, at first I thought these lectures were total nonsense like the rest of the guys, so I just returned to my room and went to sleep. It was only when these lectures began to touch on specific conditions in the States that I became interested. Of course, I knew nothing about communism or any other ism for that matter, but during my many sleepless nights I questioned again and again why we were in Korea in the first place. The more I thought about my life, the more I felt that I had been used, cheated, betrayed. As time went on, I began to think that the Chinese might have been telling us the truth. More and more, I asked myself, who really benefits from this war? The Chinese insisted that it was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, and it sounded so elementary when they told us that the capitalists in Wall Street started this war to gain new markets and raw materials in Asia. When I reflected on my life as a young black man, I had a difficult time seeing what democracy and freedom had done for me. I thought back on that cold winter day when our regiment was sacrificed to protect the white units. I recalled one afternoon when I was just 12 and I was beaten up by a white man at a gas station for seemingly no reason at all, and there were so many other indignities I'd suffered while growing up in Memphis. This naturally led to more questions. Why are there rich and poor? Why do blacks get kicked around and treated like animals? Of course, the communist answers to these questions were remarkably simple and almost too obvious. The more I thought about all these things, the more I believed that there was some truth in what they were telling us. Some back in America later called this brainwashing, but how can it be brainwashing if someone is telling you something you already know to be true? End quote. Before moving on to the next segment of this episode, I feel we should briefly discuss the most famous Western POW of the Korean War, or at least the highest-ranking one, Major General William F. Dean. Dean formerly served as the commander of military forces in South Korea during the period of U.S. military occupation. Shortly before the war broke out, he took command of the 24th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army, which was one of the first units to see action in Korea in early July 1950. Through that month, Dean commanded a series of actions to delay the advance of the KPA through the south, culminating in the Battle of Daejeon on July 16th. After 4 days of fighting, Dean gave the order to withdraw, but in the chaos of the retreat, the general became separated from the rest of his unit and spent several days wandering aimlessly about the countryside until he was finally captured by North Koreans in late August. His captors were initially unaware of his rank, and he was held with the other American POWs, but once his identity was revealed, he was removed to an underground facility in Pyongyang, where he was interrogated. At first, his interrogators wanted to extract from him intel on future UNC military operations, but when this failed, they tried to get him to sign a statement disavowing the UN's mission in Korea. This, too, did not yield any results. By October, the North Koreans gave up on trying to interrogate him altogether, and from this time onward, Dean was more or less left alone, interacting only with his guards for months on end. Unlike with most other prisoners, Dean remained in North Korean custody even after China entered the conflict. Then, in December 1951, he was allowed to be interviewed by Wilfred Burchett, an Australian journalist, writing as a war correspondent for a French communist newspaper called Ce Soir. Burchett asked Dean about his experiences and filled him in on the course of events since he'd been captured. Dean took quite a liking to Burchett in spite of their very obvious political differences, even giving Chapter 9 of his autobiography the title of My Friend Wilfred Burchett. Here, Dean explains how, from the time of this visit onward, the conditions of his captivity improved remarkably, a change that he attributes to Burchett's intercession on his behalf. The interview was published on December 24th alongside a recent photograph of Dean, proof that the general thought to have been killed at Daejeon was in fact alive. Interestingly, the narrative of Dean's autobiography more or less ends around here in early 1952 and doesn't pick up again until the end of the war in July of the following year. The intervening year and a half are intentionally relegated to just 12 pages out of the overall 300. So, at the end of the day, what is one to make of the re-education program used by the Chinese during the Korean War? What conclusions is one to draw? Unfortunately, an objective assessment is somewhat complicated by the fact that there is no definitive consensus on what the program's goals actually were. In the years and decades immediately following the war, there was a widespread belief in the Western world, not really among academics, but certainly in the popular imagination, that the Chinese had intended to reform UN prisoners into true, ideologically devoted communists. By this metric, the program can be considered an abysmal failure, but there is reason to believe that this was not really the program's true purpose. Not to get too ahead of myself, but per the terms of the armistice agreement that ended the war, both sides agreed to not forcibly return any prisoner to their home country against their wishes. When the two sides exchanged prisoners, 22 Westerners, 21 Americans, and 1 Briton declined to be repatriated. I'll talk more about these individuals in the next episode, but for now, taking into consideration that nearly 5,000 non-Korean UNC personnel were repatriated at the end of the war, it's clear that the program did not result in any mass defection. Of course, there are plenty of reasons why Western prisoners would not choose to live in China and reject their home country in such a way, even if they did sympathize with the communist cause. And it seems that the Western governments never even considered that this was a possibility. nor did the Chinese for that matter. In Adams' memoir, he writes that one of the camp's political instructors was very much taken aback when he first mentioned wanting to go to China rather than the US after the war. The Americans were absolutely confounded by the situation, and the Chinese were reluctant to comply with the prisoner's request, but the terms of the armistice agreement signed at Panmunjom applied equally to both signatories. That rather lengthy digression aside, the point is that the outright defection of these 22 men to China was most likely not the expected outcome, nor was it even a desired one. I believe that the program's goals were less ambitious and served to further more immediate strategic needs. Two in particular. Firstly, to entice UN troops to surrender in greater numbers, and secondly, to get a significant proportion of prisoners to collaborate with them during their incarceration. To the first point, we have seen several instances of the so-called lenient policy being publicized to UN troops, often with the express aim of convincing these troops to surrender, and with the prisoners themselves often being used to convey such messages. China's actions in this regard, therefore, were not as unprecedented as they were made out to be. Similar methods of psychological warfare had been used in pretty much every major conflict since World War I. But, seeing as how most UN personnel were captured well before the Chinese took over administration of the prison camps, it can be concluded that the program cannot be credited with any perceptible drop in morale of the UN forces as a whole. As to the second point, the idea that the program's goal was to facilitate collaboration in the camps, they did meet with some success in this regard. The camp administrators did not exactly keep records of how many prisoners cooperated with them and how many did not, and the designations of progressive and reactionary, as previously discussed, were not official ones. A report by U.S. Army psychiatrist William Mayer concluded, based on interviews with returning POWs, that as many as 1/3 of all American prisoners collaborated with the enemy in some form or another. That last part is significant, though, since the form that this collaboration most often took was not an offense that one could be court-martialed for. Far fewer prisoners, probably closer to 1 in 10 rather than 1 in 3, were the men that Chinese would have designated as progressives. The majority of the prisoners were, for lack of a better word, passive. They complied as much as they felt they had to in order to survive, and not very much beyond that. Still, the reports of the prisoners' general behavior in captivity sparked no small degree of anxiety in the United States, both in regards to the less than upstanding moral character of these men and the omnipresent specter of communist infiltration. Again, this is something we'll discuss more at the conclusion of the next episode. One less abstract consequence of the lenient policy was that there were no documented instances of large-scale organized insubordination in the northern prison camps. No riots, no breakout attempts, or anything of the sort. As we'll see soon enough, the same could absolutely not be said about the UN-administered prisons in the South. Before we move on to that discussion, however, there is one more subject I'd like to cover first. So far in this episode, we've spoken about the experiences of Western prisoners held by the communists at great length. The reason for this is that the great majority of literature on the subject discusses them, but numerically speaking, it is worth bearing in mind that they made up an absolute minority of the prisoners of war held by either side during this conflict. At the risk of sounding somewhat repetitive or overwhelming you with information, to put things in perspective, the communists, at least according to their own claims, held approximately 10,000 prisoners of war, of whom about 20% or less were Westerners, that is, Americans, British, and so on. Again, this figure did not account for an additional 50,000 South Korean and UNC personnel classified as missing in action. Of course, Koreans themselves were the vast majority of prisoners held by the communists, and their experiences were different from those of their Western counterparts in several respects. Simply put, the North Koreans thought of the South Koreans as their fellow countrymen who had been unfortunately led astray by foreign imperialists. They believed that they could be won over to their cause, and unlike the Chinese with Western prisoners, they did not resort to experimental psychological methods to achieve this. For quite some time, the plight of South Korean POWs was little known. This is just as much because their stories were overshadowed by those of the Western POWs, as it was due to the negative attitude of the South Korean government and society at large towards them. This began to change in the 1990s with the end of authoritarian rule in the country. At this time, a number of memoirs written by former South Korean prisoners of war were published. One such memoir is Return of the Defeated by Pak Chin-hung. As far as I know, this book has not been translated into English, but a synopsis of it does appear in Jager's book, Brothers at War. I think that by looking at Pak's story, we can begin to get a better sense of what the average experience for a South Korean prisoner of war was like. Pak Chin-hung was captured by Chinese forces in November 1950 at Dokcheon. He managed to survive the winter, during which time he endured an arduous march to the prison camp at Hwapyeong, and then to Pyeongtaung, where he and other South Korean prisoners were handed over to North Korean custody. The Korean prisoners were held separately from their Western counterparts, but subjected to similarly difficult conditions. Deaths from starvation, disease, untreated wounds were commonplace. According to Pak, between 20 to 50 prisoners died on a daily basis during the winter of 1950 to 1951. From the beginning, the North Koreans made efforts to convert their South Korean brethren to their cause. Pak writes, quote, "During the study sessions, we expected propagandistic lectures with extravagant claims, but they weren't. The gist of the sessions was, don't stay here starving, volunteer for the People's Army, fight for the fatherland and eat rice and meat. They did not try to agitate or incite us. It wasn't coercive, like asking those who wanted to volunteer to step forward. They used persuasion." End quote. Pak and thousands of others like him faced a difficult decision, one where they faced an uncertain fate regardless of the choice they made. If they remained in the camps, they faced near certain death if conditions were to remain the same as they had for much longer. The prospect of joining the North Korean army meant receiving better food, clothing, and healthcare, but the possibility of death remained ever present. Moreover, the POWs were unsure what life would be like in the North, and those with loved ones still living in the South were highly unlikely to see them again. Nonetheless, the offer was understandably appealing to the masses of sick and starving prisoners, and many chose to join the KPA. As Pak writes, quote, "They argued that it would be better to volunteer and live than to stay in the prison camps and die of starvation or typhoid." End quote. As for Pak himself, he decided to take his chances remaining in the camps, even as many of those around him chose to enlist. He recalled how one of his fellow prisoners, an old classmate of his from medical school, made this decision. Pak had tried to dissuade him to no avail. Finally, the classmate asked Pak for a favor. He wanted him to visit his family in the South after the war and tell them what had become of him. As he wrote, quote, "After I was repatriated and returned home, the very first place I went was to his house. He hadn't told us, but he was married and had a daughter. When I conveyed the news, everyone broke down in tears. I left the house in a hurry. I felt horrible, as though I had committed some sin by surviving and returning home." End quote. Much as was the case with the Western prisoners, living conditions for the South Korean POWs improved drastically at the time armistice negotiations began in the summer of 1951. Around that time, Pak was transferred to a different prison camp to the southeast, closer to the battlefront. There, he and his fellow prisoners were fed substantially better, but were also put to work by their captors. They were made to load and unload heavy sacks of rice and corn from train cars heading to the front. Due to the constant threat of aerial bombardment, the prisoners always had to work by night. This was the general state of affairs between July 1951 and the end of the war in July 1953. At the risk of getting a bit ahead of the main narrative, both sides exchanged POWs with each other after the cessation of hostilities. We'll discuss the specifics of the exchange later on, but what's important to know right now is that the Communists repatriated 11,559 POWs, of whom 3,198 were UNC personnel and 7,142 were South Koreans. However, it's almost certain that thousands more South Koreans, for whatever reason, did not return home. Arriving at an accurate idea of the number of South Korean POWs who remained in the North after the war is nearly impossible, and the estimates differ widely between sources. Figures provided by the South Korean Ministry of National Defense claim that 41,971 ROK soldiers remained unaccounted for. A December 1953 report compiled by the Soviet Embassy to the DPRK claims that between South Koreans who willingly defected to the North, mostly in the circumstances described previously, and those who remained imprisoned, 56,202 South Koreans remained in the North after the armistice. Still, other sources put the total number of unrepatriated South Koreans at 60,000 or even higher. The fates of these individuals are murky. The best and really only sources that we have regarding those who were left behind are the testimonies by former prisoners who managed to escape the DPRK years later. One such escapee named Cho Chang-ho claims that he and many other prisoners were never informed that the war had ended, and remained oblivious to this fact for years afterward. Cho was one of 670 who were sentenced to hard labor in a coal mine. As he wrote in his 1995 memoir, quote, "There are no more than 20 of us left now. Over the past 5 decades, many have died in work accidents and others died of old age," end quote. In the grand scheme of things, Pak Chin-hung was one of the lucky ones, one of relatively few South Korean POWs, if the commonly cited figures are to be believed, who were returned to the South in 1953. But the ROK government considered these former prisoners to be untrustworthy. Rather than immediately being set free, they continued to be detained in UN prison camps until it could be determined whether they were ideologically fit to re-enter South Korean society. Needless to say, these former POWs felt betrayed. They could not believe that they were being treated in such a way by their own government after having sacrificed so much for their country. Before long, the prisoners began to commit suicide in droves, often making an effort to kill themselves in the most gruesome ways possible in the hopes that their deaths might send a message. As Pak lamented, quote, "In the 1950s, everyone thought that if you had been exposed to communism, even if for a few days, you could be turned into a communist. This is something we all had to go through," end quote. The prisoners were subjected to 6 months of re-education, after which they would be screened to determine if they held any communist sympathies. They were not told what would become of them if they were to fail the screening, only that they, quote, "would have no future in South Korea," end quote. In my research, I have been unable to find specific reference to the fates of those individuals, since information about the South Korean POWs in general is quite sparse. I speculate that the case of Ri In-mo may provide some insight here. Ri was the Korean Workers' Party chief of propaganda in the city of Hungnam. When the war broke out, he became a war correspondent embedded with the KPA 6th Division. In the midst of the chaos that followed the Battle of Incheon and the breakout from the Busan perimeter, Ri broke off from his division and joined the guerrilla fighters at Jirisan, who continued to wage war behind enemy lines long after the KPA was forced to withdraw north. In January 1952, Ri and many of his comrades were captured during a joint US-ROK counterinsurgency mission codenamed Operation Rat Killer. Although he repeatedly insisted that he was a member of the North Korean Armed Forces, Ri was not classified as a prisoner of war and as such was deemed ineligible to be repatriated to the North as a part of the armistice agreement. Rather, he was tried by a South Korean civilian court and sentenced to 7 years in prison for what the judge termed hostile acts. At the end of his sentence, Ri was asked to sign a document formally renouncing his communist beliefs as a condition of his release, but he refused, time and time again. It wasn't until 1993, in the context of gradually thawing relations between the ROK and the DPRK, that Ri was finally released. He finally returned to the North at age 76, having spent half of his entire life imprisoned. He received a hero's welcome and became somewhat of a celebrity in North Korea. Ri In-mo's experience is not unique. He was just one of an indeterminate number of political prisoners held in the South, classified by the ROK government as unconverted long-term prisoners. Ri just happens to be the most famous of these because of the multiple books he wrote about his experiences upon his release. Anyway, all of this has been to suggest that the former South Korean POWs, who failed this political screening after the war, may have been treated in a similar manner to these unconverted long-term prisoners. Still, even those who did manage to pass the screening and were released shortly thereafter had a difficult time finding acceptance in post-war South Korea. To return to Pak Chin-hung, he was treated with distrust by his own countrymen, who thought that he and others like him had been turned into communist sympathizers during their time in northern captivity. He recalled an anecdote shortly after the war ended, when he was hassled by a policeman for his identification papers after being reported by someone as a suspicious individual. The incident left him feeling absolutely indignant, as he writes, quote, "How dare they, who didn't serve in the army, much less ever seen a battlefield, living safely in the rear this whole time, ask me, who had not only fought in the war but who had suffered as a prisoner of war, for identification papers," end quote. Pak noted that South Korean society treated all veterans, even those who had managed to avoid capture, with general indifference, allowing them to fall into the pits of poverty and despair. Quote, "I thought about the contemptuous looks of the young women at the coffee shop. I thought about the disabled veteran in shabby clothes with a crutch who came into the shop. He didn't even have a prosthetic leg, so one of his pant legs flopped around as he moved. He had given one of his limbs in service of his country, but became a beggar. Compared to those who had managed to avoid conscription, he was condemned to live in the shadows of society for the rest of his life. I can only pity him." End quote. Pak and others like him were not treated that much better by their own government either. On being released from custody, he was told that he would be allotted 2 weeks' leave, after which he was to report to a recruiting center in Daegu for his new assignment. The war may have been over, but he would not be discharged from the army until March 1954. Moreover, the compensation that he received from the government for the time he spent imprisoned was insultingly meager. Pak claimed that the 3 years of back pay that he was owed amounted to, quote, "only a few dollars," end quote. He spent the whole amount one night on a bottle of cheap liquor and a few cans of meat. Later, Pak read about Yang Sun-yong, a former POW who escaped from the North in 1997. He was offered a sum equivalent to $1,600 US for the 44 years he had spent imprisoned. From his memoir, quote, "I could not suppress my anguish when I heard about this. Couldn't the government have found some way to compensate him adequately? Did our service and suffering for our country truly mean so little?" End quote. Unfortunately, that is all I have about South Korean prisoners of war. As I said, this is not something that has been written about all too extensively in English language literature, or even Korean language literature for that matter, at least until relatively recently. Hopefully in the future, more and more of their stories will come to light and we can continue to piece together their experiences, but for now, let's move on to the final subject of today's episode, the Chinese and Korean prisoners held by the United Nations. As a result of the unexpected success of the UN counteroffensive in the fall of 1950, over 100,000 enemy combatants were taken prisoner. The United Nations Command had not anticipated capturing such a large number of enemy personnel, and were woefully unprepared to deal with them. Initially, these prisoners were held in Busan and the surrounding area, but because the city was such a major transit hub for the UN forces, not to mention the emergency government of the ROK, it was decided to relocate the prisoners to Gyeonggi-do, a large island 1.5 miles off the southern coast. But although here the prisoners would no longer pose an active security threat, the issue was that there were no already existing facilities on the island that could be repurposed to house these prisoners. A prison camp had to be constructed, essentially from nothing, but the UNC was either unable or unwilling to divert sufficient resources to the island. At the time the first group of prisoners was sent to Gyeonggi in January 1951, 50,000 of them to be exact, the facilities that had been built were only designed to hold 5,000. Overcrowding immediately became a serious issue, a problem that was hardly alleviated with the hasty construction of further facilities, as even these were quickly crammed to several times beyond their intended capacity. Moreover, the camp was severely understaffed, since the UNC only spared very little manpower to serve as guards. As a result, the men that were posted to Gyeonggi were not the most upstanding characters. Alan Maggio, an American soldier who served as an MP on the island for 10 months, later testified, quote, "The disciplinary situation was unbelievable. I found the whole place to be a living hell. I was in fear constantly. There were fights in the barracks, fights in the compounds. Anyone who couldn't make it on the line was sent down to do guard duty on Gyeonggi. That's how we ended up with the scum of the army, the drunks, the drug addicts, the nutters, and the deadbeats." End quote. These guards, both American and South Korean, subjected the prisoners to frequent abuse. As Private Maggio reported, quote, "The compound was run by military police who were very rough on the prisoners, often beating them up very badly. Those MPs were just waiting for trouble. They wanted something to happen. The enlisted men ran the system. There were no officers who bothered to walk around to check what was going on." End quote. With so many prisoners forced into such close proximity, it's natural they would begin to commiserate with each other. It wasn't long before they began organizing amongst themselves, staging demonstrations that occasionally turned violent. Violence between prisoners became a major issue. Many prisoners were anti-communists who had been pressed into the service of the KPA. After China entered the war and captured Chinese soldiers were also sent to Gyeonggi, the ideological divide among the prisoners was made even worse. As we discussed briefly in Episode 6, a sizable proportion of the PVA strength were former nationalist soldiers, as much as 30% by some estimates. In the field, these former nationalists and other potentially subversive elements in the army were held in check by political commissars in the chain of command. But once in UN custody and no longer subject to military discipline, many of these individuals were freed to enact vengeance against their ostensible comrades. In the following passage, Colonel Chao Zuo-ri, a political commissar in the PVA's 60th Army and an inmate at Gyoje, tells of a violent encounter he had with some anti-communist prisoners. Quote, "One day, Lee and a dozen nationalist traitors followed me into my tent and began to beat me with sticks. Why? What for? I asked as I tried to defend myself. Why? You know why," one traitor answered by shouting back at me. "Because you communists beat me in China, and now I can beat you here." Another shouted, "You communists took my land and killed my father. I want to even up this bloody debt." While I was beaten within an inch of my life, Lee just watched and laughed at me. Differences of the class struggle and hatred became one of the largest sources of conflict within the camp. End quote. At first, the camp administration made no effort to separate the prisoners on the basis of ideology, and politically motivated violence became endemic, with incidents of this nature being reported as early as June 1951. Gangs of prisoners arranged ad hoc tribunals where they sentenced their political opponents to beatings, torture, and even death. If Zhao is to be believed, the UN officials, far from doing anything to curtail this violence, actually encouraged it. He claimed that the UNC took the most zealous anti-communist prisoners and effectively set them loose on Gyoje with instructions to antagonize the more recalcitrant communists. Given that the island's garrison was unable, for the most part, to exercise direct control over the prisoners' behavior, it is plausible that they may have recruited former nationalist soldiers as enforcers, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence suggesting that this was in fact the case. In any event, though, battle lines were drawn within the confines of the camp between the communists and the anti-communists. The prisoners continued to organize among themselves politically, segregating themselves into separate compounds based on their ideological affiliation. The communists even created their own political party within organizational structure modeled on that of the CCP. Meanwhile, violent clashes, both between guards and prisoners and between opposing factions of prisoners, increased in frequency and intensity as time went on. As the armistice talks progressed and the issue of the POWs was taken up, observers on both sides were becoming increasingly aware of the volatile situation on Gyoje, and it was not long before the communists looked to exploit it. The lackluster security on the island made it possible for prisoners to communicate with Beijing and Pyongyang. Soon, they began to send agents to infiltrate the prison camp with orders to assume leadership over the communist prisoners. These commissars organized the prisoners into armed squads and enforced military discipline within them. The first large-scale confrontation at Gyoje took place in February 1952. The unrest began when the camp authorities began to screen prisoners to determine who would be repatriated after the war and who would remain. The communists opposed these efforts and tried to physically prevent UN personnel from entering the compound. The guards attempted to intimidate the prisoners into submission, leading the prisoners themselves to violently retaliate. Armed with a variety of improvised weapons, such as spears, knives, hatchets, sledgehammers, and so on, they charged at the MPs, managing to kill one and wound 38 others. 140 or so prisoners were wounded, but ultimately they had forced the guards to withdraw. Up until this point, Generals Ridgway and Van Fleet had ignored the Gyoje prison camp, seeing as how they both had more pressing concerns at the time. This incident in February was the cause for some alarm, but at that time the most that they were willing to do was open an investigation into the conditions on the island. The next month, UN commissioners came to the island to carry out an inspection of the facilities. There, communist prisoners pelted them with bricks and other debris. They observed that the communist-controlled compounds hung banners emblazoned with slogans such as, "Long live General Kim Il-sung, the acclaimed leader of our people and the supreme commander of the Korean People's Army," end quote. The commandant of the camp, Brigadier General Francis Dodd, told the commissioners that there was nothing he could do to have them taken down since the guards were now too afraid to enter these compounds. The commissioners concluded in their report that the situation on Gyoje was completely out of control. Quote, "The visit to Gyoje-do made it clear to the commission members the possibility of further disturbances. As for General Dodd, he is living on the edge of a volcano, and on any day there may be fresh outbreaks of violence and even more death." End quote. Events on Gyoje did come to a head in May 1952. Dodd was ordered to re-screen the prisoners, and this inevitably provoked renewed unrest within the camp. On May 4th, the communist prisoners, both Chinese and Korean, began a hunger strike, stating that they would only stop if Dodd met with them in person at their compounds to address grievances. Anxious to get the situation under control, Dodd agreed to meet. On the afternoon of May 7th, Dodd spoke with a delegation of prisoners through the gate to their compound. The talk seemed to be going well, but when a group of prison janitors opened the gate to take out the garbage, the prisoners' representatives suddenly ran outside and seized Dodd. In a matter of seconds, before either he or any nearby guards were able to react, they dragged him into the compound and blocked the gate. Shortly after, they raised a sign that read, in English, verbatim, quote, "We captured Dodd. As long as our demand will be solved, his safety is secured. If there happens some brutal act, such as shooting, his life is danger." End quote. Dodd's capture was not some random outburst of violence. On the contrary, Chinese and Korean communist prisoners had planned the act well in advance. Chao Zuo-ri, the PVA commissar I quoted from a couple times earlier, offered the following explanation for the motive behind the kidnapping, quote, "We planned to capture Dodd at one of the prison compounds and used the attention the event would draw to expose the UNC's abuses of prisoners to the world." End quote. Surely enough, news of this incident on Gyoje quickly spread. General Ridgway was made aware of the situation in a matter of hours. Fearing that the situation might lead to a mass breakout and a communist takeover of the island, he dispatched an infantry division and an armored battalion to Gyoje. From captivity, Dodd managed to get a note to the commander of UN forces on the island, General Charles Colson, informing him that he was alive and unharmed, but also making it clear that his captors would kill him if any attempt was made to rescue him by force. While some 15,000 UN prisoners amassed on the island, within the gates of Compound 76, 43 prisoners, representatives of each of the different communist-controlled compounds, convened to discuss their next move. They agreed that Dodd should be released unharmed, but only once the UNC agreed to meet their conditions. A list of 4 terms was drafted up. The first demand was for the UNC to stop human rights abuses of prisoners of war. The second and third demands pertained to voluntary repatriation and the prison screenings, and the fourth was for the prisoners' representatives to have a say in the camp's affairs. With these demands put to writing, the next morning Dodd was put on trial before an impromptu tribunal made of the prisoners' elected representatives. The chairman of this tribunal, a KPA general named Lee Jong-jun, addressed the defendant, explaining the reason why he had been captured and stating the prisoner's demands. Dodd would not agree, saying that he did not believe that any of the alleged crimes described had been committed under his command. Next, victims and witnesses of the POW abuses were called forward to testify. British journalist and communist sympathizer Alan Winnington, who later published a narrative of these events based on interviews with the participants, described the proceedings. Quote, "One by one they spoke, each having prepared a good deal of evidence for the accusations of violence and abuse they had allegedly suffered. It was an extraordinary account altogether, a concentrated and unvarnished tale of murder, torture, thuggery, rape, and of the unmitigated brutality of the men under Dodd's command." End quote. As all this was rather sensational, at first Dodd persistently denied that any of these accusations were credible, but in time, the constant stream of lurid stories began to affect him. Colonel Zhao, who was a member of the tribunal, wrote, quote, "We invited badly beaten and wounded prisoners to testify to the brutality of the prison guards during the screening. The clinic nurses brought their medical records as evidence and provided additional eyewitness testimony. The warehouse bookkeepers explained how the camp supplies were being stolen by ROK soldiers and sold on the black market. 2 female prisoners told their stories about the frequent gang rapes by both guards and prisoners. Dodd became nervous, and sometimes he seemed touched by the stories. He just kept repeating, 'I can't believe it, I can't believe it,'" end quote. By the morning of the third day, May 10th, Dodd broke down. After hearing another round of testimonies, he stood up from his chair and stated, quote, "I am responsible for what happened here. I am guilty," end quote. Dodd agreed to sign the document with the POW's commands, which was then presented to General Colson at noon that day. In addition to the original Korean text of the document, there was a crude but mostly serviceable English translation. I will now read this English translation of the statement verbatim, quote, 1. Immediate ceasing the barbarous behavior, insults, torture, forcible protest, threatening, confinement, mass murdering, gun and machine gun shootings, using poison gas, germ weapons, experiment object of a bomb by your command. You should guarantee POWs human rights and individual life, the base on the international law. 2. Immediate stopping the so-called illegal and unreasonable volunteer repatriation of NKPA and CPVA POWs. 3. Immediate ceasing the forcible investigation screening, which thousands of POWs of NKPA and CPVA be rearmed and failed in slavery permanently and illegally. 4. Immediate recognition of the POW representative group, commission, consisted of NKPA and CPVA POWs, and close cooperation to it by your command. This representative group will turn in Brigadier General Dodd, USA, on your hand after we receive the satisfactory declaration to resolve the above items by your command. We will wait for your warm and sincere answer." End quote. Despite this rather awkward translation, the meaning of these demands was clear enough to General Coulson for him to know that these terms were unacceptable. He sent a reply addressing each of the demands in turn, explaining why he could or could not agree to them or asking for clarification. What followed was a tense exchange of messages between Dodd, Coulson, and the POW's designated spokesperson, KPA General Kim Hak-koo. The negotiations over the terms of the document, along with the necessary rewrites and translations, took several hours, but finally, 1 hour before midnight, a final agreement was reached. Dodd, who had clearly been quite shaken by the whole ordeal but was physically unharmed, was released as promised. The final draft of the document signed by Coulson read as follows, quote, "With reference to your item 1 of that message, I do admit that there have been instances of bloodshed where many POWs have been killed or wounded by UN forces. I can assure that in the future, POWs can expect humane treatment in this camp according to the principles of international law. I will do all within my power to eliminate further violence and bloodshed. If such incidents do happen in the future, I will take responsibility." With reference to your item 2 regarding voluntary repatriation of Korean People's Army and Chinese People's Volunteer Army POWs, that is a matter being discussed at Panmunjom. I have no control or influence over the decisions at the peace conference. Regarding item 3, pertaining to forcible investigation or screening, I can inform you that after General Dodd's release unharmed, I can assure you that there will be no more forcible screening of POWs in this camp. With reference to your 4th item, we approve the organization of a POW representative group consisting of Korean People's Army and Chinese People's Volunteer Army POWs, according to the details agreed to by General Dodd and approved by myself." End quote. The Kyoto incident, sometimes also referred to as the Dodd Affair, was a huge symbolic victory for the communists. By getting Dodd and Coulson to sign the documents, they had compelled them to admit wrongdoings on the part of the UNC, and to pledge changes, most significantly to cease the screening efforts. Not only that, but the prisoners had managed to resolve the situation peacefully and on their own terms. While Chinese and North Korean media outlets triumphed in the prisoners' success, the humiliated UNC scrambled to do damage control. This task fell in large part to the recently appointed commander of the UNC and Supreme Commander of the Far East, General Mark W. Clark. Clark had only just arrived in Tokyo to assume these commands from General Ridgway on May 7th, the very same day that the hostage situation on Gyeonggi-do began. Now he would be faced with the unenviable task of cleaning up the whole mess. In his memoir, he wrote about how he felt totally unprepared to deal with a situation like this. Quote, "Although I had been briefed in Washington on every conceivable subject, this was the first time I had even heard of Kyoje, or of the critical prisoner of war problems that existed behind our lines. I felt like someone who was walking directly into a swinging door." End quote. Less than a week after Dodd's release, Clark issued a statement repudiating the allegations contained in the Kyoje-do agreement, claiming that the document, quote, "has no validity as it was made under great duress," end quote. He further alleged that any and all violence on Gyeonggi had been the work of communist provocateurs, whose aim had been to discredit the United Nations command. Ridgway concurred, later writing, quote, "The UNC was asked to plead guilty to every wild and utterly baseless charge that Red Radio had ever laid against us," end quote. Both Ridgway and Clark felt that the incident had undermined the moral authority of the United Nations and had the potential to derail the ongoing armistice negotiations at Panmunjom. Something had to be done to deflect the blame away from the UNC as a whole. Coulson and Dodd were chosen to be the scapegoats. Disregarding the fact that an official inquiry into the matter had cleared both men of any wrongdoing, Clark appointed his own hearing committee, which promptly found them guilty of negligence. Both were demoted and subsequently reassigned to postings that were little better than forced retirement. Tensions on Gyeonggi-do remained high for several weeks after the conclusion of the Dodd affair, but the UNC had absolutely no intention of abiding by the terms of the document that Coulson and Dodd had signed, since doing so would be tantamount to an admission of guilt. The new commander of the island, Brigadier General Hayden the Bull Boatner, was no exception. He was tasked with restoring order on Gyeonggi, and as his nickname suggests, Boatner was not really the type to negotiate or compromise. Meanwhile, the communist prisoners, having been emboldened by their victory, continued to challenge the authority of the prison guards by continuing to display flags and banners outside their compounds. Attempts to remove these flags and banners resulted in clashes between guards and prisoners, culminating on June 10th, when Boatner personally led troops with riot gear into Compound 76, where the most recalcitrant communists were concentrated. 31 prisoners were killed and 100 more were wounded in the ensuing battle, while only 1 soldier was killed and 14 wounded. The prisoners surrendered and were dispersed into new, smaller compounds that had been recently constructed. After this incident, the other compounds stopped their resistance and agreed to be transferred to wherever they were ordered to. Most of the Chinese POWs were sent to a new prison camp on Jeju Island, while the Korean POWs were divided between Northerners and Southerners, with the South Koreans being sent to the adjacent island of Chubong-do. By the end of June 1952, the liquidation of the Gyeoje prison camp had effectively been accomplished. But the damage control efforts undertaken by Clark, Boatner, and others could only do so much. They could not change the fact that the Gyeoje-do incident had called into question the principle of voluntary repatriation that the UN negotiators at Panmunjom were obstinately insisting on. The communists could now reject the proposal on the basis that the policy, as it had been implemented thus far, was unfair. Western officials also expressed their reservations about the policy at this time. Charles Johnson, a British diplomat, wrote, quote, "At the time of the Secretary of State's statement in the House on the repatriation question on May 7th, we had no reason to doubt the validity of the screening process. The revelations we now have of the conditions within the camp must give us serious misgivings as to the fairness and accuracy of the census. We still stand firmly on the principle of voluntary repatriation, but we must be sure that the factual foundation on which that principle rests is a sound one." End quote. As a result of this incident, the armistice negotiations threatened to stall out once more, and in the next and final episode of our series on the Korean War, we will return to our main narrative and discuss the negotiations that finally brought an end to the fighting in Korea. Afterwards, we'll discuss the war's lasting impact and how it continues to affect world politics even to this day. But again, all that will have to wait for the next episode, whenever it comes out. I hope that even though we got quite a bit off track from the main narrative in this episode, that the episode was nonetheless informative about one of the most controversial aspects of this conflict. Since the POW issue is so prominent in the conception of the Korean War in the Western world, I think that it was important for me to do my part in providing a fuller picture than one usually finds in the predominant narratives of the war. Anyway, do be sure to tune in again next time for what is hopefully the final episode of our series on the Korean War. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like for me to address, please don't hesitate to contact me at my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Of course, I can also be reached on Twitter and Facebook. Links to both sites will be available in the description. If you like the show and want to support my efforts to keep it going indefinitely, one way you can contribute is by purchasing some used books from me on eBay. It would also be immensely helpful if you left a review for the show on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you again for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.